In our last video, we talked about ways of determining whether a measurement is a good one. So we talked about reliability. Now we're going to talk about the second aspect of that, or second way of determining whether something is good, and that is validity. So reliability and validity are related to each other, but not the same. You can be a measure can be less valid than it's reliable, but can't be more valid than it's reliable. So, we can have a consistent measure, such as a broken scale, that consistently says that I weigh 84.7 pounds. I don't. But what you want to be thinking about is that, it can be reliable when it's broken. Even a broken clock is right 2 times a day, but it can't be more valid than it's reliable. So reliability is necessary, but not sufficient for validity. It has to be consistent. So here we have a place where we have poor validity, but good reliability. And here, poor validity and poor reliability. Our scores are all over the place, never hitting the bullseye. Here, we have good validity and good reliability. All the scores are clustered and in the bullseye, measuring exactly what we expect. So we're going to be looking at 5 different measures or different kinds of construct validity, 2 of which are subjective, face validity and content validity, and 3 of which are more empirical, so criterion validity, convergent validity, and discriminant validity. So face validity looks like what you want to measure. If your first exam only had calculus questions, you'd go, this is not a good measure of my understanding of research methods. Content validity says, does it contain all aspects that your theory says it should contain? So if your exam only included questions from chapter 3, that would be problematic. And you'd say, this measure has low content validity. Think about the DAT. Does it include all measures that you believe, all measures of creativity that you believe it should have? And think about what kind of validity we're talking about here, face validity or content validity. Does the DAT look like a measure of verbal creativity? And again, think about what kind of validity we're talking about there. So our third measure of validity is criterion validity. Does it correlate with key behaviors? So for example, score on this test aptitude scale really strongly correlated with sales figures. This is a great measure, and I would use it with all of my interviews, as I'm hiring new salespeople. And here's another measure, aptitude test B. And we see that there's a whole lot more scatter. So probably not as good a measure of sales as this one. So if I had to choose between the 2, I would choose A, even if it were a little more expensive or, some other kinds of weaknesses in choosing a scale. With criterion validity, another way of measuring it is what key behaviors are predicted or are related to it. So for example, if fitness steps is a good assessment of movement towards fitness goals, what would you expect it to be correlated with? So I might expect that heart rate and blood pressure might be related to the number of steps that I take, perhaps body weight, perhaps longevity. So if those scores, if those other behaviors are not related to fitness steps, then I would question whether we should be thinking about this. We also expect that it should correlate with key groups. So for example, we might expect that BDI score, Beck Depression Inventory, would be higher for people judged depressed as opposed to people who aren't. And in this case, we're seeing, significantly more, a significantly higher relationship. We might also expect that if we looked at ratings of how severe the depression is, that those would be related to Beck Depression Inventory scores. And again, that's something that we find. So both of those are good things. Now, we also expect that when we have groups that are that the different kinds of groups might score differently. So for example, if we're looking at the average well-being scores, we're seeing higher well-being scores for college students, both American and French, and for Korean students, and for print, also high for printing trade workers, but relatively low for people who are hospitalized at the Veterans Affairs Hospital. That's certainly consistent with what we would expect. It is also low for male prison inmates. It is surprisingly high, though, for abused women. And that might be something that we would wonder about and say, maybe there's something else that we need to know here. So let's look a little bit at life stories. McAdams and his colleagues looked at the kinds of stories that people tell about their lives and divided them into two different kinds of categories. So people who tell contamination stories say, life started out well, but then it went downhill. It was ruined, contaminated, whatever, by events. And they also tend to conclude, I'm bad, the world's bad, unfair, I have no control, and these bad things will continue. Commitment stories start out good, bad things are transformed or redeemed. And we learn some positive things like, I'm able to hear and understand other people's suffering. And maybe it helps me to set goals for the future. So if these stories are useful, then we would expect them to be related to certain kinds of or other kinds of behaviors, including life satisfaction, self-esteem, coherence, and depression. And we expect certain kinds of patterns in terms of what we find. That is, that people who tell commitment stories, I got something positive out of these bad things, would report more life satisfaction, somewhat more self-esteem, more sense of coherence, that life makes sense, and less depression. While people who are telling stories like, started out good and then went downhill, poorer life satisfaction, poorer self-esteem, poorer coherence, and more depression. Does this match what we think? Certainly, this matches what we would expect in terms of face validity and also in terms of criterion validity and known groups, evidence. Finally, what we expect is that two measures of the same thing should correlate pretty highly. So for example, the Beck Depression Inventory correlates well with this other measure of depression, the CESD. However, we would expect that it should not be really related to other kinds of different things. So convergent validity means that things come together. Discriminant validity means they're not as similar as we expect. And here we're finding a correlation of 0.16 between a Beck Depression Inventory score and health problems. Some relationship, but not one that you'd write home to mom. So return to your 3 operationalizations of political orientation and think how you might assess for validity of each operationalization.